Short disclaimer as we begin this week's podcast. This is not an episode about show business this week. This is an episode about these current events that are happening in March of 2021. And the interview with J.W. Walker was conducted before the last 2 weeks' events of gun violence happened. The views expressed in this podcast are those of Michelle Bruckner. So I just wanted to say that before we begin. Thank you.
Showgirl Tip of the day. She's gonna help you find your own way. Showgirl Tip of the day. All you gotta do is just Showgirl Tip of the day.
Hi, everybody. As I'm recording this, it is a beautiful spring morning. And yesterday, many people lost their lives in Boulder, Colorado, due to gun violence. Last weekend, they lost their lives at a house party in Philadelphia. And last week, Asian American women were the victims of gun violence in the Atlanta area. Gabrielle Giffords was shot in the head over 10 years ago, and she lived, but she's not the same. She struggles with her recovery. She has some damage that can never be repaired. My next guest today is J.W. Walker, who is an activist, and he is part of an organization that I belong to called Gays Against Guns. And make no mistake, the gun issue in America is very divisive. It's very political. Some people believe they have the right to bear arms because it's in the Constitution. But let me say it here. Nobody has the right to take somebody else's life. The guy in Atlanta got a gun that very day. You can't even register to vote that same day in Georgia. When is the madness going to stop? We need action. We need very strict laws to make sure that nobody else can be in a public space or a private space and lose their lives. Come on. Enough is enough. I'm tired. And I'm tired of people losing their family members. And I'm tired of not even feeling safe in my own beautiful country of the United States of America. Wake up. When is it gonna stop? Here's my interview. Welcome, J.W. Walker, to the Showgirl Tip of the Day podcast. I want to introduce this really amazing person to the audience. He's an activist, Rise and Resist, Gays Against Guns, Sing Out Louise, and Reclaiming Pride Coalition. Did I get it right?
Yep. Yeah, Reclaim Pride Coalition, but close enough.
Reclaim Pride Coalition. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. You know, I'm over here talking about show business, and you are out there on the street in the world making change. Do you want to talk about what led you to be such an active activist?
Sure, absolutely. I had been involved in activism back in the late 90s in the wake of Matthew Shepard's death. I helped start an organization called the October 19th Coalition, which was, the day. Basically, a political funeral had been held for him sort of right after he died, and the NYPD had sort of gone in and charged on horseback into all of these queer activists who were just really mourning him and just doing a march and in solidarity and against hate crimes. And so I went to the first meeting after that, and we from the sort of these two spontaneous occurrences, started this October 19th coalition to focus on hate crimes against LGBTQ people, against Black people, against really any marginalized people. You may remember there was the James Byrd, that lynching in Texas at the same time, where he was dragged at the back of a truck. That had happened a few months before Matthew Shepard died. So I worked with those folks for about a year and a half. We ended up getting hate crimes legislation passed in New York. Then I went to work for Gay Men's Health Crisis for about 10 years in the development department. I kind of left sort of street activism behind. Then when I left Gay Men's Health Crisis, I sort of left that whole world behind, activism, advocacy, all of it. Was working in real estate. I a little collectivism once social media started happening, but I really wasn't actively involved in any of the movements. And then on June 12th in 2016, Mad Men stormed into the Pulse nightclub in Orlando and just killed 49 people and injured another 51 people. And he himself was killed. And a few days after that, some folks who I didn't know at the time called for a meeting at the LGBT Center here in New York on 13th Street. And a former GMHC board member, a friend of mine, just sent me the link to the meeting, said you might be interested in this, because I'd been putting stuff up on Facebook about how just distraught I was about that horror. And so I went to that meeting, and there were a few people that I knew from my past at GMHC, from my work with the AIDS Walk, from the October 19th Coalition. And, we just decided that it was time for gay folks, really, for queer folks, to sort of take the reins in this battle against gun violence, against this gun violence epidemic, and to sort of use the techniques that we have used for marriage equality, really from the fight against AIDS and ACT UP, to sort of bring something to the gun violence prevention movement that really hadn't been there before, which was direct action, which was, in the streets protests. The gun violence prevention movement before that was, very good and very effective and, got some things done, but it was done sort of behind the scenes and, in lobbying and having meetings with Congress people and vigils and things of that nature. And we sort of looked at that sort of mise en scène and said, where's the anger? Where's the screaming in the streets? Where's the noise making? Where's that passion? And we said, we can bring that along with some flair and some glitter and some great gay imagery. And so we started Gays Against Guns about, the nightclub shooting happened on the 12th. 2 weeks after that was Pride. It happened on a Sunday. 2 weeks after that was Pride Sunday. And so in that 2 weeks, we managed to amass 1,000 people to march with us in a contingent. Now Speaker Corey Johnson, the Speaker of the New York City Council, who was just the council member for Chelsea and West Village and North Soho, because we were so late in the process, it was too late to sort of arrange a space in the Pride Parade that year. And so Corey very generously gave us his space in the parade that was already set up. And we were able to march, and we made a big impact. We got a big front page picture in the New York Times the next day. Our human beings, which is a really important part of our work in GAG, which are the people that you may see at many protests dressed all in white and veiled and holding a placard with the name of, in that case, it was each person holding a name of one of the people murdered at Pulse. And then we just sort of went off from there and started protesting, people whom we call NRA puppets, like Lee Zeldin, who is the Republican Congress member for the 1st District of Long Island, who recently announced that he's going to try to run for governor, which we'll have something to say about. And really putting that focus on the NRA, which I think we did very effectively in concert with a bunch of other gun violence prevention groups all over the country. But we did that sort of loud in the street, doing civil disobedience, going into the halls of Congress, doing actions, really theatrical actions in very, very public places and at very public events, just to sort of keep that thing in the headlines, keep that in the news cycle, keep that, we have this tendency in this country to talk a lot about gun violence right after we have a mass shooting, and then it dies down and you don't hear anything in the papers or anything for quite some time until there's another mass shooting or another assassination or another really horrible kind of shooting event that makes headlines, and then it dies down again. And so we wanted to fill that space between those mass shootings with meaningful action to try to do our part to keep people's minds and eyeballs on the issue. And I think that we did that really effectively. We learned how to work with other groups that were in the more traditional mode of gun violence prevention, and to coordinate our efforts with theirs and to work on campaigns where they could do the sort of press conferencey thing and we could do the sort of protest thing, and that worked really well. And so that whole process, that was June of 2016. So that whole process between June and November, it just sort of reawakened that activist spirit in me, so that when the worst possible election results ever happened. We in New York just did not take it laying down at all. I just sort of threw myself into groups that were forming in resistance to Donald Trump and to his agenda and to everything he stood for. Particularly at that time, it was Rise and Resist, but also Refuse Fascism, which I did. I worked with them for about a year, and just sort of continued on from there as a sort of founding member of those groups. And then as also that Christmas period, Gays Against Guns had come up with an idea to do gag reflex. Well, no, actually at the time it was Gag Nog, which was to do a little choral group around town called Gag Nog, where we rewrote all these Christmas carols to be gun violence prevention, anti-gun violence carols. Like I'm blanking on names right now. Rudolph the Gunshot Victim, Silent Night, Deadly Night. A lot of really sort of dark and twisted takes on traditional Christmas carols. And so we were Gag Nog during the holiday season. And then that following January 2017, of course, was the Women's March. It was no longer Christmas, so we couldn't do any of those Christmas songs. And in the meantime, we had changed the writing right after the election to about half of the songs being against gun violence and half of them being about Trump. So we did Donnie the Con Man was our number one hit with a bullet that first year. First Christmas season. So then we went to the Women's March and we rebranded ourselves as Gag Reflex, and we did a lot of patriotic standards and pop songs, but basically really focused on Trump and the threat that he posed to the country. And then that broke off into its own organization called Sing Out Louise, and I remained a part of that. And we've been singing in the streets ever since. Not nearly as good as you sing, my dear, because I've had the great pleasure of hearing you perform. But
Thank you.
Good enough for a street corner. Good enough for a street corner.
So I read a gag post that said there's been 40 shootings since this year has begun already. I noticed that the shootings were down during lockdown. What is your take about this year? And every day I go to sleep at night and I pray that somebody that needs help will get the help they need before they make the choice to resort to committing a mass act of violence, every day. And I read that the father of one of the Sandy Hook victims, it was the kid's 15th birthday yesterday, and he should have been on his high school bus with his brother and sister. And he made it till 6 years old, not 15. So what is your take about this year? And it doesn't seem like we're off to a good start at all.
No, it seems to get worse every year. And this past year it's been a very interesting sort of lens to see the gun violence epidemic in this country through. Because you're right, when we first went into lockdown, a lot of violent crime went down, including gun violence for that first couple of months. And then once we got to the summer, and this whole pandemic just was not letting up. People were losing family members, or people were losing income and losing their jobs and not knowing where the next anything was coming from, and not having any kind of stability in their housing unless they were sitting on some measure of wealth or had some broader support system. And what I think I learned the most about it is that the presence of gun is the worst indicator about the amount of gun violence that you're going to have, because what brings on these most horrific incidences of gun violence are either personal stressors, but I think less is normally personal stressors, right? Omar Mateen, who shot up Pulse, he was possibly conflicted about his sexuality. His father was a very religious person. He was perhaps forced into marriage to his first wife and then a second wife. And that's the way that those kind of dynamics work on the psyche that can lead to someone acting out. So, we've seen that, many times in these sort of mass shooting incidents. Obviously, Sandy Hook is another very strong case of someone who had serious emotional and psychological problems, and who had then had access to his mother's guns. And so we sort of know how those kind of stressors work on the individual. But I think that last summer, what we saw, especially in a lot of major urban areas, outside of the racial reckoning that was also happening, which, while necessary in and of itself, is a stressor, right? But what we see is how communal stressors can have this really strong effect on the communal psyche. And we saw this huge uptick, over 200% increase in gun violence instances of gun violence and gun violence deaths, certainly here in New York City, but I think in several other major urban areas. And the common thread is just the preponderance, the number of guns that are present, that are easily accessible, that are being trafficked in through what we call the iron pipeline from suburban and rural areas and areas with lax gun laws into major cities like New York or Chicago or Detroit, which may have the strongest gun laws they possibly can in an urban area, but as long as someone can drive a car there from somewhere else, then the laws in this city don't do a whole lot. Because these guns are still coming in. So we know, we sort of see how just this sea of armaments that are present in all of our major urban areas, when there are these societal stressors, the presence of them, the availability of them just makes it almost inevitable that we're going to have that kind of violence, because we're human beings. And the one thing that we know about human beings is that human beings react to stress with violence, and we don't have enough support for people's emotional health, for people's psychological health, for people's social health in our culture. That's not something that we have valued. That's not something that we have put into a place of importance broadly. And so if we have nothing to work to heal that kind of stress, that kind of turmoil, that kind of community strain that a situation like the pandemic, brought about, it's kind of inevitable when there are guns everywhere that people are going to act out with them.
And I also think a big portion of this in the 70s, in the 80s, there were state-funded institutions and doctors that worked with mental health, and those all got shut down. And so many people that I see in New York they live on the street, and some of those people cannot take care of themselves. They don't belong on the street. Who's taking care of them? I think we have to take care of them. And Absolutely. People don't want to do it. They don't want to do it.
We saw what happened on the Upper West Side with the homeless shelters.
My good Lord. Yeah. There was a lady that I knew that actually lived in one of those places, and she overheard her neighbor being talked to by a social worker. And the social worker said, "Do you like your room?" And the person said, "I love my room." Why is it so difficult for these basic needs not to be met as a society?
It really is disturbing, because it's another one of those instances where people allow their emotions to override their common sense. And we see it constantly with the way that certain groups vote against their own interests. If we spend the money as a city, as a state, as a country to create spaces where people can get this sort of healing and can get this sort of control over their lives and get access to medication and get access to counseling and all of those sorts of things, heal themselves, it's better for society as a whole. It's better for everybody. It makes people make more money. It reduces the stresses on the culture, and it makes everyone's life better. I mean, there was at the beginning of the lockdown, once we got into, say, late March, early April, do you remember when you would go outside? I don't know. Some people went outside. I would go outside and have a walk, or I would go to meet a friend outside and have a little walk friend. And with all of that emptiness around, the one thing that you could see so clearly was the number of homeless people, the number of people struggling who couldn't lock down, who had nowhere to go. Our shelter system has been broken for as long as I've lived in this city, and that's 35 years. And so they were just sort of brought into high relief through the absence of so many, of all other people going about their daily business on the subways, especially, and just out on the streets. And, it was just, it just hit you, because you just know that, especially in this city where we have the NYPD being the first line of contact by the city, by the state, by the powers that be, with these homeless people. And we see how often those contexts lead just to throwing people in jail, violence against these homeless people, taking their belongings and throwing them away. The list goes on and on. And, it just sort of, when I was out there at that point, April, May, I was like, it would be so easy, for the city to set up a team of social workers and psychologists to go out and talk to these people and see what they need, see what they would like. I mean, there are obviously always going to be some people that they just want to live out there. They just, that's the way their psychology goes when they've been too long out of treatment, and there's not a lot you could do. But a lot of those people out in the streets, like the woman that you spoke about in the hotel, would love nothing more than to have the security of having a place to lay their head at night and feel safe and to feel warm and to have that measure of control. But we miss every opportunity as a society to make that happen. And it's just so sad and so damaging.
What do you suggest to someone who's listening? Because I have a lot of young people listening to this. What's something that we can do as an individual to just make some sort of change? Because this whole thing is a cycle and it's a circle. And I feel that if we don't do something, it's just going to keep perpetuating. And what can we do? What do you suggest?
Well, and right now we're still in this place of pandemic, right? So that makes it that much harder, because normally what I would say is go out, volunteer, go out, get your friends together and go volunteer at a shelter or try to work on some new initiative that gets out there. But right now we can't do that. And so for young people especially, and really for anyone, I've personally have used this time when I'm not out making noise in the streets. I've used this time at home alone. I got COVID laid off last May, so I haven't been working since then. But I've used that time. I've read about all of these issues that I never had time to read about. I always talk about how the resistance changed the left in some really fundamental ways, but mostly what it did is it unsiloed all of us. We left this space of environmentalists over there doing their thing, and disability activists over there doing their thing, and abortion rights people over there, and queers over there, and trans over there. And we all came together with this common enemy. And in that process, we learned so much about each other, and we learned about each other's struggles, and we adopted each other's struggles. We said, your struggle is my struggle is your struggle, and we're all in this together. And that was beautiful. And so after that 4 years of hell / a lot of joy, because we found a lot of joy in resistance, didn't we? It was good to have that time to reflect, and good to have that time to sort of read and to delve into things that I hadn't had the opportunity to delve into. For young people, I always want to recommend reading as much as you can about topics from reputable sources. Read, learn as much as you can. You can join online communities to flesh out your knowledge and to make those connections. And then maybe by next fall, after if 1,000 young people in New York City read up on homelessness and learned the issues and learned about the needs and the struggles and the history and the way that the laws have been twisted and turned and turned into something that doesn't help anyone, maybe they can come together and get out in the streets after we've finally beaten this virus back. Maybe they'll come up with innovative solutions from a perspective of youth and not being weighed down by history and by all of the baggage that our generation is carrying around from having seen failure after failure after failure, different places. Maybe they'll actually be able to come up with some great new ideas.
Does this kind of work energize you, or does it drain you?
Overall, it energizes me. The connections that you make in this kind of activist work are just gold. The people, like I said, when I went to that first Gays Against Guns meeting, I did know a few people around the room, but once we started really actively organizing and making a structure in Gays Against Guns and what have you, and formed our steering committee, and I sat on that and still sit on that 5 years later, I was working with a bunch of people I had never met before, with a bunch of people from different backgrounds, different ages, all of those sorts of things. And that is so meaningful to me. meeting people and hearing their stories and finding out from where they're coming from, getting their perspective. That to me is the most energizing thing imaginable. And so, yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. There have been times when I've had to, be a good old Southern lady and take to the bed for a day or two and just and order in every meal, even before lockdown. But no, just overall, it's life energy to me.
You know what? I saw you walk by a group of police officers. I think we were on the way to a meeting on a Thursday night. You said something to them, like something about all the overtime they were getting, about what was going on in the world. But the way you said it was, I was like he's just so cool. The way you said it was, you were nice to them, but yet you were acknowledging like the situation, and yet you were just like really strong in your own personhood. And I was like, I want to be more like that. I want to be like a bad, what? I don't curse on my podcast, but you know what I'm saying. But I have to let you go because you have another meeting. But
with that thing, though, with the cops, I have a whole set of issues with the NYPD. I've been jacked up by cops over the years for absolutely nothing because I fit a description, long before I was doing any of the activist work at all, even 20 years ago. But there is this. It's a dance that activists in New York play with the NYPD. You're a performer. There's a performative aspect to it. We have our roles. We know what they are. And when they're being normal, it can be perfectly acceptable. It's that balance between freedom of speech and order. And, we know what our rights are. They know what their orders are. And usually everything's fine unless the majority of the people who are doing the action are Black or brown and young or trans or queer. And then it starts getting twisted because then you're dealing with the emotional issues that these cops have and the built up detritus that they have from whatever they come from. And that's when we have these really horrible situations that have developed over the course, since last summer. Queer Liberation March, which I'm a part of, which is coming back this June on Pride Sunday. We had a great hands-off thing from the cops for the entire route of the march last year. Cops that were assigned to us they respected our wishes. They hung back. We marshaled ourselves. Everything was fine. We got everybody from Foley Square up to Washington Square Park and into the park. And at the very, very tail end, the guys that had been accompanying us had gone practically, or they were sitting in their cars or whatever. We get to the very tail end, and then the response team, I can't remember what their actual initials are, emergency response team, ERT maybe, from the NYPD had apparently been laying in wait near Washington Square Park, and then they just attacked the tail end of the march on Waverly Place for no reason, for absolutely no reason. Well, technically the reason was that somebody scribbled on a cop car in a maybe 2-inch by 4-inch space on a cop car with a Sharpie, but that was enough for them to violently grab that person and then attack other people. And it's this odd circumstance with the NYPD where they just organize themselves to this place of attacking protesters, and we got to fix it. So that's going to be a big part of my work coming out of the last year.
I hope we can continue our conversation because there's so much to talk about, but I know you have to go. I so appreciate your time tonight. I just want to say I love what you're doing. I respect you. I think you're wonderful. Please come back.
Thank you. I'd love to come back and see you anytime. And I can't wait to see you sing again. I can't wait till we can be back at Joe's Pub and I can hear you belting out a tune or two.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, okay?
You too, Michelle. Bye-bye.
Bye. The Showgirl Tip of the Day podcast has original music composed by Joshua Holloway. Find him on YouTube, Joshua Holloway Music. This podcast is written by Michelle Bruckner and edited by Michelle Bruckner and Joshua Holloway. Find me on Instagram, Showgirl Tip of Day. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week with a new episode.